She had come down looking for the kitchen maid, hoping for a fresh cup of peppermint tea to soothe the relentless crushing migraines that had plagued her for the past 6 months. Instead, she had found her husband, Duke Richard Sterling, and his sister, Lady Georgiana, sitting at the long mahogany table, discussing her as if she were already dead. "She looks like a ghost, Richard. A pathetic, raving ghost." Georgiana's voice carried through the crack in the curtains. It was a harsh, brutish voice, completely devoid of the aristocratic refinement she pretended to possess in public. "I give it 2 more weeks, 3 at the absolute most before she breaks completely." Eleanor felt the floor drop beneath her. Her heart, which had been beating with the sluggish, sickly rhythm of an invalid for months, suddenly spiked with a violent jolt of adrenaline. She peered through the narrow gap between the heavy red velvet fabrics. Richard was slouched in his high-backed chair, swirling a glass of brandy despite the early hour. His oval face, which Eleanor had once thought gentle and kind, now looked flabby and weak in the morning light. "It feels wrong, Georgiana," he muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "She was wandering the halls again last night, weeping about shadows. I almost pitied her." "Pity is for the poor, Richard." Georgiana snapped, slamming a small glass vial onto the polished table. The sharp clinking sound made Eleanor flinch. "You married her for the Sterling estate, an estate she controls, an estate that goes to charity if she divorces you. We need her declared legally incompetent. Once the magistrate signs the medical order, you become her sole guardian, and the wealth is ours." Eleanor's pale, sickly gray eyes widened. The room spun around her. The nausea that she thought was a symptom of a mysterious illness surged up her throat, but it tasted entirely of betrayal. "The dose," Richard whispered, staring at the vial. "Are you sure it isn't lethal?" "It's heavily concentrated nightshade and arsenic derivatives," Georgiana said, leaning forward. Her asymmetrical green eyes gleamed with a predatory satisfaction, her heavy jaw set in a cruel line. "It won't kill her. It will just destroy her nervous system, induce severe paranoia, and erode her memory. The doctor will see a classic case of hysterical madness. He'll sign the asylum papers without a second thought. And my dear brother, you will be free of the frail little bird." Eleanor's nails dug so fiercely into her own cheek that she almost drew blood. Her knees weakened, nearly sending her collapsing to the hardwood floor, but a primal dormant instinct for survival locked her joints in place. Every headache, every night sweat, every moment she had forgotten her own words, mid-sentence looking up at Richard with tear-filled eyes, apologizing for her failing mind. The times Richard had held her hands, stroking her hair, whispering that she was safe, that he would take care of her. It was all poison, literally. Georgiana picked up the vial and tilted it toward the light. "I'll add 3 drops to her morning tea from now on instead of 2. We need to accelerate the decay. The magistrate arrives at the end of the month." "Fine." Richard swallowed hard, looking away. "Just make sure she doesn't suffer more than necessary." "Oh, stop being a coward," Georgiana scoffed. "She's a stepping stone, Richard. Nothing more." Eleanor did not wait to hear another word. Moving with a terrifying, silent precision she didn't know she still possessed, she backed away from the curtains. Her bare feet made no sound on the rugs. She navigated the long, drafty corridors of Sterling Manor, like a phantom, her nightgown trailing behind her like a shroud. When she finally reached her bedchamber, she closed the heavy oak door and locked it with a soft click. The sheer weight of the revelation crashed down upon her. She slid down the door, her knees pulling up to her chest, and clamped both hands over her mouth as a silent, agonizing scream tore through her lungs. Hot tears spilled over her hollow cheeks, leaving wet tracks on skin that was pale as parchment. She had loved him. She had trusted him with her life, her inheritance, her vulnerabilities. She had thought she was losing her mind. She had spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, terrified of the darkness, terrified of her own brain, failing her, apologizing to a husband who was slowly, meticulously slipping venom into her cup. Her eyes drifted to the bedside table. There, resting on a silver tray, was the morning tea the maid had brought up an hour ago. The tea, she had complained, tasted a bit too bitter, prompting her trip downstairs. Eleanor crawled across the Persian rug. Her limbs felt heavy, poisoned by months of toxic accumulation. She reached up with a trembling, translucent hand and grabbed the teacup. She stared at the amber liquid inside. 3 drops. She looked at her reflection in the mirror across the room. Her jet-black hair hung in lifeless, lank strands around a face that looked 10 years older than its 32 years. Her collarbones jutted out sharply against her frail chest. She looked like a victim. She looked exactly like a woman destined for a padded cell in a country asylum. A strange, unfamiliar heat began to rise in her chest. It started as a spark of pure outrage and bloomed into a roaring, glacial fire. The tears stopped. Her breathing, which had been frantic and shallow, began to slow down. The trembling in her left hand ceased. She did not cry anymore. The woman who had wept for months over her fading sanity died on that bedroom floor. Eleanor slowly stood up. She carried the teacup to a large potted fern sitting near the window and poured the liquid into the soil. She watched the dark stains spread across the dirt. Then she picked up her silver tea strainer. She looked closely at the fine mesh. Caught in the tiny silver wires were minuscule dark residues, the physical proof of her husband's murder attempt. She walked to her mahogany writing desk, opened a hidden drawer, and pulled out a clean white linen handkerchief. Carefully, with hands that were growing steadier by the second, she tapped the strainer against the fabric, catching every last speck of the dark powder. She folded the handkerchief meticulously and placed it deep into her jewelry box, locking it with a small golden key. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Heavy, confident, arrogant footsteps. Richard. Eleanor quickly rushed to her bed, pulling the thick down comforter up to her chin. She let her eyes glaze over, allowing the haunted, confused expression to return to her face. She let her hands tremble again, resting them atop the blankets. The door handle rattled. Then Richard used his own key to open it. He walked in, his face arranged in a mask of perfectly practiced concern. "Eleanor, my darling," he said softly, walking to her bedside. "Are you awake?" "Richard," she whispered, her voice fragile, raspy. She looked at him. The man who had kissed her at the altar. The man who was planning to lock her away in a madhouse. "You didn't drink your tea," he noted, glancing at the empty cup and then the tray. "I drank a little," she lied smoothly, her heart beating like a war drum, but her face a portrait of pathetic frailty. I spilled the rest. My hands, Richard. They won't stop shaking. I dropped it." Richard sighed, reaching out to stroke her lifeless hair. Eleanor forced herself not to flinch. She leaned into his touch, enduring the sickening feeling of his skin against hers. "It's all right, my love," he murmured, his watery blue eyes looking at her with a mix of fake pity and real disgust. "Georgiana is bringing you a fresh cup soon. You need your medicine. You want to get better, don't you?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered, staring right into his eyes. Behind her dull gray gaze, a lethal, terrifying sanity was taking root. "I want to get better. I will do exactly as you say, Richard." "Good girl," he smiled gently. As he turned and walked out of the room, Eleanor watched his back. "Enjoy your victory, Richard." She thought the silver tea strainer hidden safely beneath her pillow. "Because the woman you are trying to break is going to tear your world apart, brick by brick." The heavy oak door of the bedchamber creaked open 30 minutes later. Eleanor remained perfectly still beneath her thick down comforter, her eyes fixed vacantly on the canopy above. The approaching footsteps were not Richard's hesitant pacing. They were sharp, deliberate, and entirely lacking in sympathy. Lady Georgiana walked into the room carrying a silver tray. Atop it sat a fresh cup of porcelain white tea, steaming faintly in the cold draft of the manor. Georgiana did not knock, nor did she soften her voice. She moved with the arrogant entitlement of a woman who already considered herself the mistress of the house. "Sit up, Eleanor." Georgiana commanded, her harsh, brutish voice grating against the quiet of the room. She set the tray on the bedside table with a loud clatter. "You need your medicine. Richard said you spilled your last cup like a clumsy child." Eleanor forced her breathing to become ragged. She slowly pushed herself up against the headboard, letting her lank, jet-black hair fall across her pale face. She made her hands tremble violently as she reached out a perfect portrait of a woman whose nervous system was failing her. I'm sorry, Georgiana, Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. There were shadows in the corner. They startled me. Georgiana's asymmetrical green eyes narrowed with vicious satisfaction. She picked up the teacup and thrust it toward Eleanor. There are no shadows. Drink it. All of it. The doctor insisted you cannot miss a single dose. Eleanor took the cup. Her trembling fingers rattled the fine porcelain against its matching saucer. The scent of the tea was heavily masked with peppermint, but beneath the minty surface, Eleanor's heightened senses caught the faint metallic bitterness of the poison. It was the same scent that had accompanied her descent into hell over the past 6 months. She brought the cup to her lips. She could feel Georgiana watching her like a hawk, waiting for the prey to swallow the hook. Eleanor tilted the cup, taking a large mouthful of the hot liquid, but she did not swallow. She held it in the back of her throat, letting the bitter taste burn her tongue. She lowered the cup, her hand shaking so deliberately that a splash of the dark tea spilled over the rim, staining the white fabric of her loose nightgown. "Careful, you idiot!" Georgiana snapped, stepping back to avoid the splash. Eleanor coughed weakly, pressing a hand to her chest. It burns today." "It is working," Georgiana replied coldly. "Drink the rest." Eleanor repeated the process, taking another mouthful and holding it. When the cup was finally empty, she set it back on the tray with a pathetic, whimpering sigh. She slumped back against the pillows, closing her eyes as if the effort had exhausted her entirely. "Good," Georgiana muttered, picking up the tray. "Sleep now. The shadows won't hurt you." The moment the door clicked shut and the lock engaged, Eleanor sat up. She threw back the covers, scrambled to the edge of the bed, and spat the mouthful of poisoned tea into a brass wash basin on her nightstand. She wiped her mouth frantically with the back of her hand, gasping for clean air. The bitter taste lingered, sickening and vile, but a fierce, triumphant heat flared in her chest. She had won the first battle, but she knew the hardest part was yet to come. Over the next 4 days, Eleanor turned her bedchamber into a secret laboratory of survival. Every morning and every evening, Georgiana or a maid brought the tainted tea. Every time Eleanor feigned submission, holding the liquid in her mouth, spilling bits onto her increasingly stained nightgown to maintain the illusion of complete physical deterioration, and then spitting the rest into the potted fern or the wash basin the moment she was alone. But the physical toll of abruptly stopping the poison was agonizing. Her body had become dependent on the daily intake of the nightshade and arsenic derivatives. The withdrawal hit her like a physical blow. On the second night without the poison, Eleanor collapsed onto the Persian rug, her body racked with violent, uncontrollable shivers. Cold sweat soaked through her clothes. Her joints ached with a deep grinding pain that made her want to scream. She lay on the floor, biting down on a rolled-up towel to muffle her groans, her nails digging into the wool fibers of the carpet. "Let it hurt," she told herself, as a wave of nausea folded her in half. "Let it burn the weakness out of you." She spent hours shivering in the dark, staring at the moonlight filtering through the heavy drapes. But as the physical agony peaked, something miraculous began to happen in her mind. The thick, suffocating fog that had clouded her thoughts for half a year began to part. The confusion, the memory lapses, the terrifying paranoia, they slowly dissolved, like morning mist under a rising sun. Her memory sharpened. She remembered the exact clauses of her mother's inheritance trust. She remembered the name of the old family solicitor in London, a man fiercely loyal to the Sterling bloodline, not the man she had married. She remembered who she was before Richard had reduced her to a trembling ghost. By the 5th day, her mind was crystal clear, a terrifyingly sharp weapon hidden behind a facade of complete madness. And she knew she had to perform that madness flawlessly. If Richard and Georgiana suspected for a single second that her mind was healing, they would abandon the slow poison and opt for a faster, fatal method: a tragic fall down the grand staircase. An accidental overdose. She had to convince them that their plan was working perfectly. That evening, Richard insisted she join him and Georgiana for dinner in the main hall, likely to observe the progress of the increased dosage. Eleanor allowed the maids to dress her. She did not brush her hair, leaving the lifeless black strands hanging in chaotic clumps around her gaunt face. She wore a faded gray wool dress, allowing her shoulders to slump forward, erasing any trace of the aristocratic posture she had been taught since childhood. When she shuffled into the dining room, Richard and Georgiana were already seated. The heavy velvet curtains, the very curtains where Eleanor had learned the truth, were drawn tight against the night. "Eleanor," Richard said, his voice dripping with that unbearable fake sympathy. "Come sit. You look tired." Eleanor did not look at him. She stared blankly at the wall, just above his head, her gray eyes wide and unblinking. She walked slowly to her chair, her steps dragging. When she sat down, she kept her hands in her lap, letting them tremble visibly against the fabric of her dress. A servant placed a bowl of hot soup in front of her. Eleanor picked up the silver spoon, her grip awkward and weak. She brought the spoon halfway to her mouth, then abruptly dropped it. It clattered loudly against the porcelain bowl, splashing hot broth onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" Georgiana sighed in disgust, rolling her asymmetrical eyes. Eleanor ignored her. She tilted her head toward the empty chair beside her, her expression twisting into a mask of terrified confusion. "Mother," she whispered to the empty air. "Mother, why is it so cold in here? The walls are breathing again." Richard stiffened, dropping his fork. He looked at Georgiana, a flicker of genuine unease crossing his fleshy face. "She is hallucinating again," he murmured. "Worse than yesterday. It means the treatment is reaching its peak," Georgiana replied smoothly, taking a calm sip of her wine. She looked at Eleanor as one might look at a dying insect. "She won't last until the end of the month. We should move the magistrate's visit forward to next Tuesday." Eleanor's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her face remained a portrait of a broken mind. Next Tuesday. That gave her less than a week. 7 days before a judge would arrive to strip her of her legal rights, her wealth, and her freedom. She let out a pathetic, whimpering sob, covering her face with her trembling hands. "Make them stop whispering, Richard," she cried, rocking back and forth in her chair. "Please make them stop. Take her back to her room." Richard ordered the servants, his voice tight with revulsion. "I cannot eat with this spectacle." As the maid gently guided her away from the table, Eleanor peeked through her fingers. She saw Richard staring at his wine, his cowardly face pale. She saw Georgiana smiling a cruel, triumphant smirk. "Smile while you can," Georgiana, Eleanor thought, letting her head loll onto the maid's shoulder. "Enjoy your stolen authority." Back in the safety of her locked bedchamber, the madwoman vanished. Eleanor stood up straight, her spine aligned with aristocratic grace. The trembling in her hands ceased instantly. She walked to her locked jewelry box using the small, golden key hidden under her mattress. Inside, resting on the velvet lining, was the white linen handkerchief. Over the past 5 days, she had faithfully filtered every cup of tea through her silver strainer before discarding the liquid. The pile of dark, toxic residue inside the handkerchief had grown substantially. It was no longer just a suspicion. It was a physical mountain of evidence. But evidence in a locked room was useless. She needed an ally on the outside, someone who could transport this proof to London without alerting the lords of Sterling Manor. She turned toward the door as a soft, rhythmic knock sounded. 2 taps, a pause, then 1 tap. It was a code she'd established years ago with the only person in the manor she implicitly trusted, Martha, a kitchen maid who had grown up on the Sterling estate and whose loyalty belonged to Eleanor's late father, not to Richard. Eleanor opened the door just enough to let the young woman slip inside. Martha looked terrified, her eyes darting to the corners of the room. "My lady," Martha whispered, bowing quickly. "You asked for me." Eleanor stepped fully into the moonlight, filtering through the window. For the first time in months, she did not look hunched or broken. She stood tall, her gray eyes sharp and commanding, radiating a cold, devastating authority. Martha gasped softly, stepping back completely unaccustomed to seeing the Duchess look so terrifyingly sane. "Martha," Eleanor said, her voice dropping the raspy frailty it had carried for half a year. Her tone was smooth, precise, and absolute. Are you loyal to the Duke, or are you loyal to the Sterling name? Martha swallowed hard, looking at the fierce intelligence burning in Eleanor's eyes. To you, Your Grace, always to you. Eleanor walked to her desk, taking out the silver-nibbed fountain pen she hadn't touched in months. She quickly scrawled a short-coded message on a piece of thick parchment. She folded the letter, placed it in a small leather pouch along with the linen handkerchief containing the poison residue, and handed it to the maid. I need you to take the early morning carriage to London tomorrow, Eleanor commanded quietly. Find the address on this envelope. Give this pouch directly to Mr. Thomas Arris, the solicitor. Do not speak to anyone else. If anyone asks, you are visiting a sick aunt. Yes, Your Grace, Martha whispered, taking the pouch with trembling hands. She looked at Eleanor, tears pooling in her eyes. They said you were lost, my lady. They said your mind was gone. Eleanor turned toward the large mirror, looking at her pale face, the stained nightgown, the lifeless hair. She smiled a cold, terrifying expression that did not reach her eyes. My mind has never been clearer. Martha, Eleanor said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of the silver tea strainer on her desk. Now go. Let them believe the Duchess is dying. We have a courtroom to prepare for. For the next 3 days, Eleanor Sterling transformed her bedchamber into a grand stage, and she was its most dedicated actress. The physical withdrawal from the poison had fully passed, leaving behind a body that was finally beginning to repair itself. The dull, persistent ache in her joints faded, and the terrifying fog in her mind was entirely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp clarity that felt almost lethal. But she knew that if Richard or Georgiana noticed even a fraction of this recovery, her life would end before she ever reached a courtroom. She had to hide her healing behind a masterpiece of fabricated insanity. She stopped washing her face, allowing the natural oils and the ash from the fireplace to turn her complexion into a sickly smeared gray. She dragged a piece of cold charcoal from the hearth and spent hours kneeling on the floor, frantically sketching chaotic, jagged lines and nonsensical symbols on the expensive silk wallpaper. When the maids came to deliver her meals or her medicine, she would rock back and forth in the corner, muttering to invisible figures, her fingers stained black with soot. The most dangerous piece of evidence in the room was the potted fern by the window. Having absorbed days' worth of the toxic tea, the plant had withered into a grotesque blackened husk. Its leaves were curled and brittle, stinking faintly of decay. If Georgiana had a shred of botanical knowledge, she might realize that a simple lack of water did not cause a plant to die in such a chemical-violent manner. On Friday afternoon, just as she heard Richard's heavy footsteps approaching the corridor, Eleanor took action. She stood up, grabbed the heavy ceramic pot with both hands, and hurled it violently to the floor. It shattered with a deafening crash, scattering dark poisoned soil and broken roots across the Persian rug. Richard threw the door open, his eyes wide with alarm. He froze in the doorway, staring at the destruction. Eleanor dropped to her knees amidst the dirt, plunging her hands into the soil. She looked up at him, her gray eyes blown wide in a mask of absolute terror. "It was watching me, Richard," she shrieked, her voice cracking perfectly. "The leaves, they had eyes. They were whispering your name." Richard visibly recoiled, pressing a handkerchief to his nose to ward off the smell of the damp earth. He looked at her not with pity, but with profound revulsion. The woman kneeling in the dirt, her nightgown stained with soil and old tea, was no longer the elegant duchess he had married. She was a monster of his own making. "Clean this up," Richard barked to a maid who had rushed up behind him. He didn't even look at Eleanor as he turned on his heel and marched away. "And keep her locked in. I will not have her wandering the halls in this state." Eleanor remained on the floor, weeping loudly until the maid hastily swept up every last trace of the poisoned soil and the dead plant, taking the evidence far away to the estate incinerator. Once the door clicked shut and locked, Eleanor's tears stopped instantly. She calmly wiped the dirt from her hands with a damp cloth, her breathing perfectly steady. The stage was secure. That night, at precisely 2 a.m, the agreed-upon signal came. 2 taps, a pause, 1 tap on the heavy oak door. Eleanor unlocked it silently. Martha slipped into the room, wrapped in a dark woolen cloak, her cheeks flushed red from the cold night air. The maid was panting, having walked the last 2 miles from the village to avoid the noise of a carriage entering the Sterling estate. "Martha?" Eleanor whispered quickly, pulling the girl into the room and locking the door behind her. "Were you seen?" "No, Your Grace." Martha gasped, pulling a sealed leather pouch from beneath her cloak. "I went straight to Mr. Arris's office in London. I handed it only to him exactly as you commanded. He told me to wait in the back room while he sent the handkerchief to a trusted chemist." Eleanor took the pouch. Her fingers, which she had forced to tremble all day, were now completely still. She broke the wax seal of the letter inside. It was written in the sharp, meticulous handwriting of Thomas Arris, the solicitor who had served her father for 40 years. Eleanor moved to the sliver of moonlight near the window to read the words that would determine her fate. "Your Grace, the contents of the handkerchief have been analyzed by Dr. Hemlock, a toxicologist bound to absolute secrecy. Your suspicions were tragically correct. The residue contains high concentrations of a tropabelladonna deadly nightshade and a slow-acting arsenic compound. The dosage is designed to mimic severe hysterical decline, leading to permanent neurological damage if continued. It is, by all legal definitions, premeditated attempted murder. Yours in absolute loyalty, T. Arris." Eleanor lowered the letter. A cold, profound silence filled her chest. It was a terrifying strategy. Mr. Arris was asking her to walk willingly to the executioner's block to lay her head down and trust that the blade would be stopped a millimeter before it severed her neck. "My lady," Martha whispered nervously, watching Eleanor's face. Is it bad news?" "No, Martha," Eleanor said softly, folding the letter and holding it over the flame of her single candle until it turned to ash. "It is the best news I have received in 6 months. It means we are going to war." She turned to the maid. "You have done brilliantly. Now you must return to your duties. Act as though I am a ghost. Pity me, ignore me, do whatever you must to blend in. On Tuesday, this manor will burn to the ground, metaphorically speaking. Ensure you are standing out of the fire." Martha nodded fiercely, her eyes shining with tears of loyalty, before slipping back out into the dark corridor. The weekend passed in a tense, suffocating blur. Eleanor continued to play the madwoman, refusing to eat the food they brought, demanding the windows be boarded up because the light was screaming. She could hear Georgiana gloating through the door, loudly telling the servants that the Duchess was in her final days of coherent thought. But as Sunday evening descended, bringing with it a heavy, oppressive rainstorm that battered the windows of Sterling Manor, the rhythm of the house abruptly changed. Eleanor was sitting on her bed, her mind actively reviewing the clauses of her trust, when she heard footsteps approaching. Not just Georgiana's sharp heels, but the heavy, deliberate tread of a stranger, and they were walking much too fast. Tuesday was still 2 days away. The magistrate wasn't due until then. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Georgiana stepped into the room, her asymmetrical eyes gleaming with malicious intent. Behind her stood a tall, gaunt man in a dark tailored suit. He carried a worn leather medical bag. He had a sharp, predatory face with eyes that looked entirely too intelligent to be easily fooled. "Eleanor," Georgiana said smoothly, "I have brought a specialist from London to see you, Dr. Silas Croft. He is going to evaluate your condition." Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. A doctor? Now? Georgiana wasn't waiting for the magistrate's appointed physician on Tuesday. She had brought in her own man, a hired gun, in a medical coat to write the certificate of insanity early. This way, the magistrate would only have to rubber stamp an already signed medical document. "I don't want a doctor," Eleanor whimpered instantly, falling into character. She scrambled backward on the bed, pressing her back against the headboard and pulling her knees to her chest. "They have needles in their eyes. Make him leave." Dr. Croft did not look sympathetic. He did not look repulsed like Richard. He simply looked analytical. He walked slowly toward the bed, setting his bag on the nightstand. "Fascinating," Dr. Croft murmured, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "Severe paranoia, visual hallucinations, motor tremors." He reached out suddenly and grabbed Eleanor's left wrist. His grip was like a vise of cold iron. Eleanor gasped, thrashing weakly. but he held her wrist firmly, pressing two long fingers directly against her pulse point. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through Eleanor's carefully constructed facade. A woman enduring severe nightshade poisoning and a hysterical breakdown would have a chaotic, galloping, irregular heartbeat. Her skin would be clammy, her pupils dilated to the edge of the iris. But Eleanor had been off the poison for nearly a week. Her body was calm. Dr. Croft stared down at her, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. He felt the steady, strong, perfectly rhythmic pulse of a healthy, terrified, but fundamentally sane woman, thumping steadily against his fingertips. The room fell into a dead, absolute silence, save for the rain lashing against the glass. "Well, Doctor," Georgiana demanded from the doorway, crossing her arms impatiently. "Is she as far gone as she appears? Can you sign the certificate of permanent incompetence?" Dr. Croft did not answer immediately. He maintained his iron grip on Eleanor's wrist. He leaned in closer, his face mere inches from hers. He looked past the soot smeared on her cheeks, past the tangled, lifeless hair. He looked directly into her clear, gray eyes. Eleanor stared back. In that microscopic fraction of a second, the mask of the madwoman slipped. She stopped whimpering. Her breathing leveled out. She looked at him with the cold, calculating intelligence of a duchess who knew exactly what game was being played. He saw it. She knew he saw it. Dr. Croft's thumb pressed slightly harder into her pulse point. The power dynamic in the room balanced precariously on the edge of a knife. If he spoke the truth, if he told Georgiana that the Duchess's pulse was as steady as a marathon runner's, and her eyes were clear of toxins, Eleanor would be dead by morning. Eleanor held his gaze. She didn't plead. She didn't beg. She simply stared at him with a silent, defiant challenge, waiting for the axe to fall. Dr. Silas Croft did not break eye contact. His thumb remained pressed against Eleanor's steady, rhythmic pulse. The silence in the bedchamber grew so heavy, it felt suffocating, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain against the window panes. Eleanor waited for the betrayal. She waited for the gaunt doctor to turn to Georgiana and announce that the Duchess of Sterling was in perfect physical health, fully lucid, and entirely aware of the poison she had been fed. If he spoke those words, Georgiana would undoubtedly lock the door, and Eleanor would not survive the night. But as the seconds ticked by, Dr. Croft's lips curved into a very faint, deeply cynical smile. It was the smile of a man who recognized a fellow survivor, but whose loyalty was firmly tethered to his own greed. He was not a physician evaluating a patient. He was a mercenary appraising a battlefield. He realized she was perfectly sane, and he simply did not care. Dr. Croft released her wrist and let her arm drop limply back onto the bed. He turned to Georgiana, his face instantly smoothing into a mask of grave professional concern. Tragic," Dr. Croft declared, his gravelly voice echoing in the cold room. "Her pulse is dangerously erratic, racing like a frightened rabbit's. Her skin is clammy and her pupils are entirely unresponsive to the light. It is a textbook presentation of advanced hysterical neurosis, compounded by severe dementia." Georgiana exhaled a sharp breath of triumph, her asymmetrical eyes lighting up with predatory joy. "Is it permanent, Doctor? Irreversible?" Croft confirmed without a trace of hesitation. He walked over to the mahogany writing desk, unlatched his worn leather medical bag, and withdrew a thick sheet of official parchment bearing the crest of the London Medical Board. "She is entirely incapable of managing her own affairs, her estate, or her person. I will draft the certificate of permanent medical incompetence immediately." Eleanor slumped against the headboard, forcing her breathing to turn ragged and shallow, whining softly at the shadows. Internally, a wave of profound, icy relief washed over her. Dr. Croft's corruption was the final key to her salvation. By knowingly signing a fraudulent medical document, he was elevating their domestic plot into a federal crime against the Royal Court of Chancery. The scratch of Dr. Croft's fountain pen against the heavy parchment sounded like the striking of a match. He signed his name with a violent flourish, pressed his medical seal into a drop of hot red wax, and handed the document to Georgiana. Georgiana snatched the paper as if it were a solid gold bar. She stared at the signature, her heavy jaw set in a cruel grin. From the pocket of her silk dress, she produced a thick leather coin purse and pressed it into Dr. Croft's waiting hand. The heavy clinking of gold sovereigns filled the air. "Your discretion is deeply appreciated, Dr. Croft," Georgiana purred. "We will present this to the Chancery magistrate tomorrow morning to formalize my brother's guardianship. You will not be needed at the courthouse. My deepest sympathies to the Duke for his burden," Croft replied smoothly, slipping the purse into his coat. He glanced back at the bed, his dark eyes meeting Eleanor's, for one final, fleeting second. A silent, acknowledging smirk passed over his face before he turned and followed Georgiana out of the room. The heavy oak door slammed shut. The lock engaged with a definitive heavy clunk. Eleanor lay perfectly still for 10 minutes, listening as their footsteps faded down the long, drafty corridor. When she was absolutely certain she was alone, she pushed herself out of the bed. The trembling actress vanished. The posture of the broken victim melted away. Eleanor stood in the center of the dark room, her spine as straight as a steel rod, her breathing deep and controlled. The trap was armed. Tomorrow morning, Richard and Georgiana would walk into the Royal Court of Chancery in London, present a forged medical document purchased with blood money, and attempt to steal a peerage estate. But they could not steal what was no longer there to be taken. It was time to leave Sterling Manor. Eleanor moved to the wash basin. She poured cold, clean water from the ceramic pitcher, ignoring the chill that raised goosebumps on her arms. She picked up a bar of lavender soap and a rough linen cloth. Leaning over the basin, she began to scrub her face. She washed away the soot, the grease, and the deliberate grime she had layered onto her skin for the past week. The water in the basin turned a murky, dirty gray. With every pass of the rough cloth, she felt the ghost of the madwoman shedding from her bones. She scrubbed until her pale skin was flushed red raw and flawlessly clean. Next, she untangled her matted hair. She dragged a heavy silver brush through the jet-black strands, wincing as the bristles caught on the knots. She brushed relentlessly until the dullness gave way to a high-gloss shine. Gathering the heavy weight of her hair, she twisted it into a severe, immaculate chignon at the nape of her neck, securing it with sharp iron pins. There would be no loose strands, no vulnerability. She stripped off the tea-stained, foul-smelling nightgown and let it drop to the floor like a discarded skin. From the back of her wardrobe, she pulled out a simple, dark navy traveling dress and a heavy wool cloak. She dressed quickly, her hands moving with mechanical precision. Finally, she pulled a small leather valise from beneath her bed. Inside, she placed the last few items of true value she possessed: her mother's original inheritance journals, the remaining trust papers, a velvet pouch containing her personal jewels, and most importantly, the silver tea strainer. The physical weapon that had nearly ended her life was now the artifact that would end theirs. At exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, the soft, familiar knock sounded at the door. 2 taps, a pause, 1 tap. Eleanor heard the rasp of a heavy iron key turning in the lock. Martha had stolen the master ring from the housekeeper's quarters. The door swung open silently on well-oiled hinges. Martha stood in the hallway holding a single shielded candle. The maid looked up and her breath hitched in her throat. The woman standing before her was not the frail, weeping creature of the past 6 months. Eleanor looked terrifyingly regal in the dim light, her sharp features illuminated by the flickering flame, her eyes cold and piercing. "The carriage is waiting at the crossroads, Your Grace," Martha whispered, bowing her head deeply. "You are a brave woman, Martha," Eleanor said softly, stepping out of the bedchamber and closing the door behind her for the final time. She did not look back at the room that had been her prison. "When the authorities arrive tomorrow, tell them nothing. Play the frightened servant. Your loyalty will be rewarded before the week is out." They moved through the silent corridors of Sterling Manor like 2 shadows. The house was asleep, groaning under the weight of the endless rainstorm outside. They crept past the grand portrait gallery, where generations of Sterling ancestors stared down from their gilded frames. Eleanor did not glance at them. They were no longer her family. As they approached the main staircase, a low murmuring sound froze them both in place. Eleanor put a hand out, stopping Martha. The sound was coming from the open double doors of the library on the ground floor. The glow of a dying fire flickered against the hallway walls. Eleanor crept forward, peering silently around the doorframe. Richard was slumped in a large leather armchair by the hearth, a half-empty bottle of expensive brandy resting on the small table beside him. His velvet smoking jacket was unbuttoned, his tie loosened. He was asleep, his head tilted back, snoring softly, as Eleanor watched his face twitched in his sleep. "Eleanor," he mumbled, a weak, pathetic sound escaping his lips. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Eleanor stood in the doorway, staring at the man who had promised to love and protect her. A few weeks ago, hearing him apologize in his sleep might have broken her heart. It might have sent her running into his arms, begging him to stop, the poison begging him to love her again. Now she felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity. Only the cold, clinical detachment of a judge viewing a condemned man. His apologies meant nothing when his hand was the one pouring the nightshade. She turned away without making a sound and gestured for Martha to follow. They slipped out through the heavy iron doors of the servants' kitchen, stepping into the freezing, rain-soaked night. The wind whipped Eleanor's dark cloak around her ankles, but she did not shiver. The cold felt purifying. They hurried down the muddy gravel path, keeping to the tree line to avoid the sight lines of the manor's upper windows. When they reached the main iron gates at the crossroads, a black unmarked carriage was waiting in the shadows. The horses stomped restlessly in the mud. The carriage door opened from the inside. A man in a dark overcoat leaned out. It was Mr. Thomas Aris. The elderly solicitor looked at Eleanor, his sharp eyes taking in her composed posture and the steel in her gaze. "You made it, Your Grace," Mr. Aris said, his voice thick with relief. Eleanor turned to Martha, pressing a heavy gold coin into the maid's trembling hand. "Go back. Sleep well, Martha. The nightmare ends tomorrow." Eleanor stepped into the carriage, settling onto the leather seat opposite the solicitor. The driver cracked the whip, and the carriage lurched forward, immediately swallowed by the stormy night. "The trap is set," Eleanor asked, her voice steady over the rumble of the wooden wheels. "Perfectly," Mr. Aris replied, handing her a large sealed folder. "The royal injunction has been signed by the High Judge based on the chemical analysis of the tea. The King's Guard will be standing in the alcoves of the Chancery Court by 8 in the morning, and as requested, I have brought the trunk containing your mother's belongings to my London office. Your new attire is waiting." Eleanor took the folder, tracing the heavy wax seal of the royal court. The carriage rattled violently as it hit a rut in the road, but she sat perfectly still, looking out the window as the dark silhouette of Sterling Manor faded into the distance. The scared, poisoned wife was dead. The untouchable Duchess was awake, and she was riding toward the dawn to burn their legacy to ash. The Royal Court of Chancery in London was a monument to absolute authority. Its vaulted ceilings stretched high into the shadows, supported by massive marble pillars that made the people below look small and insignificant. The air inside smelled of beeswax, old parchment, and the cold dampness of the stone floors. Light filtered through tall, narrow stained glass windows, casting long colored shadows across the polished mahogany benches. At exactly 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, the courtroom was sparsely populated. A few clerks shuffled papers at the lower desks, while a gallery of minor aristocrats and legal observers sat quietly in the back rows, eager for a taste of high society scandal. Sitting in the front row, looking the very picture of a grieving, devoted husband, was Duke Richard Sterling. Richard wore a meticulously tailored suit of charcoal gray wool with a black armband fastened around his bicep to symbolize his deep, preemptive mourning for his wife's mind. His thinning, light brown hair was slicked back, but a faint sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead and upper lip. He kept his hands clasped tightly on his lap, occasionally taking out a white silk handkerchief to dab at his brow. Beside him sat Lady Georgiana. Unlike her brother's nervous disposition, Georgiana radiated an aggressive, almost vibrating confidence. She wore a heavy gown of dark plum silk, sitting rigidly straight. Her asymmetrical green eyes locked onto the raised oak bench of the presiding magistrate. Hungry for the moment the gavel would fall, and the Sterling fortune would officially transfer into their hands. Case number 47. A bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the high stone walls. The petition for permanent guardianship and financial proxy, regarding Her Grace Duchess Eleanor Sterling, Duke Richard Sterling petitioner, High Magistrate Lord Pendleton, an elderly man with a face like carved granite and a reputation for zero tolerance for frivolity, looked down over his spectacles. He adjusted the thick stack of papers on his desk. Duke Sterling. Lord Pendleton's voice was dry and authoritative. Please approach the bench. Richard stood up, taking a deep breath to steady his trembling hands. He walked to the wooden podium, gripping the edges tightly. He let his shoulders slump just enough to convey the heavy burden of a tragic husband. Your Honor. Richard began, his voice thick with practiced emotion. I stand before you today with a broken heart. For the past 6 months I have watched the woman I love slip away into the shadows of her own mind. I have brought doctors, I have offered every comfort, but her condition has deteriorated beyond the reach of medicine. In the front row, Georgiana raised a lace handkerchief to her eye, wiping away a completely fabricated tear. The court has reviewed the medical certificate submitted yesterday, Lord Pendleton said, picking up the heavy parchment bearing the red wax seal, signed by Dr. Silas Croft of the London Medical Board. The diagnosis is severe hysterical neurosis, compounded by paranoid dementia. Dr. Croft states that the Duchess is entirely incapable of rational thought, prone to violent hallucinations, and requires permanent confinement for her own safety. It is true, Your Honor, Richard whispered, hanging his head. She no longer recognizes me. She throws herself against the walls, screaming at invisible monsters. She destroys her room. She refuses to eat. It is agony to witness. A tragedy of the highest order, Your Grace. Lord Pendleton sighed, his stern face softening with genuine sympathy for the Duke's plight. The Sterling estate is vast and complex. It cannot be left in the hands of someone who is medically incompetent. Given the severity of Dr. Croft's evaluation, the court sees no reason to delay this transition of power. It is in the best interest of the estate, and the Duchess herself, that you assume full legal and financial control immediately. Georgiana's hands gripped the wooden pew in front of her so hard, her knuckles turned white. Her heavy jaw clenched in a triumphant smirk. They had won. The millions, the lands, the generational wealth, it was all finally theirs. Lord Pendleton dipped a long, silver-tipped quill into a crystal inkwell. He hovered the pen over the final transfer decree. By the authority vested in me by the Crown, I hereby grant, crack, the sound of the massive, heavy oak double doors at the back of the courtroom, swinging violently open, echoed like a gunshot. The heavy brass handles slammed against the stone walls, shaking the dust from the tapestries. Lord Pendleton's hand froze. The quill hovered an inch above the paper. A drop of black ink fell, staining the wood of his desk. Every head in the courtroom snapped toward the back entrance. Richard twisted around his heart, lurching into his throat. Georgiana stood up half out of her seat, her eyes widening in shock. The morning sunlight poured in from the grand hallway, illuminating the silhouette of a woman standing in the center of the doorway. For a fraction of a second, Richard thought it was a ghost. But as the woman stepped over the threshold and into the cavernous courtroom, the light caught her features and the air physically left Richard's lungs. It was Eleanor, but it was not the broken, trembling, filthy madwoman he had left locked in a bedroom at Sterling Manor. Duchess Eleanor Sterling walked down the center aisle of the Court of Chancery. She wore a sharply tailored, impeccably fitted emerald green riding habit that accentuated her tall, commanding posture. Rows of polished silver buttons gleamed on her chest. Her jet-black hair, which had hung in lifeless, matted clumps for months, was pulled back into a severe, immaculate chignon that exposed the sharp, aristocratic lines of her cheekbones and her slender neck. Her pale skin was flawless, radiating health and a terrifying, icy calm. She wore black leather gloves, her hands completely steady. She did not shuffle. She did not tremble. Every step she took was measured, purposeful, and dominant. The sharp click-clack of the heels of her leather riding boots against the marble floor rang out in the absolute stunned silence of the courtroom. Richard felt his knees go completely weak. He gripped the wooden podium, his knuckles turning white, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a dying fish. The sweat on his forehead suddenly felt like ice. "What is the meaning of this?" Lord Pendleton demanded, peering over his spectacles at the approaching woman. "Bailiffs, secure the doors. Who are you, madam, to interrupt a royal proceeding?" Eleanor stopped, perfectly aligned with the podium, standing just 3 feet away from her paralyzed husband. She did not even look at Richard. She kept her chin high, her piercing gray eyes locked onto the High Magistrate. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance, Your Honor." Eleanor's voice rang out clear, as crystal and sharp as cut glass. There was no raspy frailty, no breathless panic. It was the voice of a woman born to rule. "But considering you are holding a pen over a document that signs away my life, my liberty, and my ancestral estate, I felt my physical presence was required." Lord Pendleton lowered his quill slowly, his eyes darting from the medical certificate on his desk to the vibrant, imposing woman standing before him. You claim to be Duchess Eleanor Sterling. I do not claim to be Your Honor," Eleanor replied smoothly, peeling off her right leather glove with deliberate slowness. "I am." "That is impossible!" Georgiana finally shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the vaulted room. She pushed past the wooden gate, rushing forward. Her asymmetrical eyes were wild with panic and fury. "She is having a manic episode, a moment of hysterical clarity. She escaped her confinement. Bailiffs seize her. She is a danger to herself." Eleanor slowly turned her head. She looked at Georgiana with an expression of such profound, chilling disdain that the older woman actually stopped in her tracks. "Sit down, Georgiana," Eleanor commanded. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a weight so heavy that it seemed to push the air out of the room. "You are embarrassing yourself in front of the magistrate." Georgiana opened her mouth to scream, but the absolute lack of fear in Eleanor's eyes silenced her. It was the look of a predator watching a rat walk into a trap. "Your Honor." Richard stammered, his voice breaking entirely. He looked at Eleanor, terror radiating from his watery blue eyes. I do not understand. She was terribly ill just yesterday." "Yes, Richard," Eleanor said softly, finally turning her icy gaze upon him. "I was terribly ill. For 6 months I was plagued by migraines, tremors, hallucinations, and a rapid decline in cognitive function. It was a terrifying experience. I truly believed I was losing my mind." She turned back to Lord Pendleton, who was watching her with rapt, astonished attention. "But then, Your Honor, a miraculous thing happened." Eleanor continued, her voice echoing perfectly in the quiet room. "I stopped drinking the peppermint tea my husband and his sister so lovingly prepared for me every morning and every night. And suddenly, within a week, the madness evaporated. A collective gasp swept through the gallery of observers in the back rows. The scratching of the court reporters' pens suddenly became frantic. Richard took a step backward, his back hitting the wooden railing. You are lying," he breathed, but he sounded like a cornered child. "Am I?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. She turned slightly, looking back toward the double doors she had just entered. Stepping into the courtroom, moving with quiet dignity, was Mr. Thomas Aris, the Sterling family solicitor. In his hands, he carried a thick, heavy legal folder bearing the crest of the royal court. And stepping out from the shadowed alcoves along the walls of the courtroom, moving with synchronized precision, were 6 members of the King's Guard, their red coats and polished rifles gleaming in the morning light. "I believe, Your Honor," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a tone of devastating finality, "that Mr. Aris has some updated medical documentation for the court to review. Evidence that proves I am not suffering from hysterical neurosis. I am suffering from severe premeditated nightshade poisoning." The entire courtroom froze. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to fall. Richard collapsed into the wooden chair behind him, burying his face in his hands, while Georgiana let out a strangled, breathless sound of pure terror. Eleanor simply stood in her emerald green habit, a queen reclaiming her stolen throne, and waited for the execution to begin. "Mr. Thomas Aris." His footsteps, steady and measured, approached the raised oak bench of the High Magistrate. The courtroom was so deathly quiet that the rustle of the papers inside his leather folder sounded like the crackle of a burning fire. He handed the thick stack of documents up to Lord Pendleton. "Your Honor." Mr. Arris began, his voice projecting clearly to the stunned gallery. "Contained within this file is a comprehensive toxicological analysis performed by Dr. Arthur Hemlock, the chief chemist for the Royal Crown. The subject of the analysis was a linen handkerchief and a silver tea strainer, both recovered from the private bedchamber of Duchess Eleanor Sterling." Lord Pendleton adjusted his spectacles, breaking the wax seal on the folder. His granite-like face grew darker and more rigid with every line he read. "The analysis confirms," Mr. Arris continued, turning slightly to look at Richard and Georgiana, "the presence of highly concentrated Atropa belladonna deadly nightshade mixed with a slow-acting arsenic derivative. The poison was administered daily, expertly calculated to mimic the exact symptoms of hysterical neurosis and paranoid dementia without causing immediate death. It is a method of murder designed not to kill the body quickly, but to assassinate the mind, thereby allowing the perpetrators to seize control of the Sterling estate through the very legal channels we stand in today."
Lies!
"Lies!"
All
Georgiana
lies
shrieked.
you
Her heavy square jaw
conspire
trembled with a mixture of rage and sheer terror.
I am
She pointed a
innocent.
shaking, jewel-encrusted finger at Eleanor.
Truth
"She is a mad
is
woman.
a
She poisoned herself to frame us. It is the paranoia speaking, Your Honor.
I
She is insane.
demand
Is she?"
justice.
Lord Pendleton asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He looked down at Georgiana with an expression of absolute disgust. "Because the woman standing before my bench possesses more composure than you do, Lady Georgiana. And this court does not take allegations of forged medical documents lightly. The certificate is real," Georgiana cried desperately, clinging to the edge of the wooden pew. "Dr. Croft signed it. He examined her. He saw the madness." "Indeed he did," Mr. Arris said smoothly. He nodded to the captain of the King's Guard standing near the entrance. The heavy oak doors opened once more. 2 guards in pristine red coats marched into the courtroom. Between them, his wrists bound in heavy iron irons, was Dr. Silas Croft. The gaunt, predatory doctor looked pale, his arrogance entirely stripped away by the reality of a royal arrest warrant. Georgiana's face drained of all color. The asymmetrical green eyes widened so far the whites showed all around her irises. She stumbled backward, hitting the wooden bench behind her, her breathing turning into high-pitched, panicked gasps. "Dr. Croft," Lord Pendleton said, leaning over the bench, "you signed a certificate of permanent medical incompetence for the Duchess of Sterling yesterday evening. Do you stand by your diagnosis?" Dr. Croft looked at Georgiana, then at Eleanor, who was watching him with that same terrifyingly calm intelligence she had shown him in the bedchamber. He swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor," Dr. Croft said, his gravelly voice echoing in the silent room. "The Duchess is in perfect physical and mental health. Her pulse was steady. Her eyes were clear. There was no hysteria." "Then why, doctor, did you condemn her to an asylum?" Lord Pendleton demanded. "Because I was paid to do so," Croft confessed, hanging his head. "Lady Georgiana offered me a purse of 300 gold sovereigns to write the certificate without question. She told me the family required the Duchess to be legally removed to secure the estate's finances. I knew the Duchess was sane. I signed it anyway." Pandemonium erupted in the gallery. The minor aristocrats gasped, whispering furiously behind their fans and top hats. The reporters scribbled wildly, knowing they were witnessing the greatest aristocratic scandal of the decade. "He is lying," Georgiana screamed, her voice breaking into a hysterical screech. "He is trying to save himself. Richard, tell them she is mad." She grabbed her brother's arm, shaking him violently. But Richard Sterling was no longer a duke in anything but name. He was a broken, cowardly man whose entire world had just collapsed onto his head. He looked at the guards, at the magistrate, and finally at Eleanor. He fell to his knees on the cold marble floor. "Eleanor." Richard sobbed, tears streaming down his fleshy face, his carefully slicked hair falling into his eyes. "Eleanor, please. I did not know the extent of it." Georgiana said, She said it was just a mild sedative, just something to calm your nerves. I never wanted to hurt you. I loved you. I swear to you, I loved you. Eleanor looked down at him, the man she had slept beside, the man she had trusted. Seeing him weeping on the floor did not bring her joy, nor did it bring her sorrow. It simply brought a profound, freezing closure. If you loved me, Richard, Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a quiet, devastating register that forced the entire courtroom to strain to hear her, you would have drunk from my cup. But you watched me tremble in the dark. You watched me apologize for a failing mind that you were actively poisoning. You did not love me. You loved the wealth my name provided, and you were too much of a coward to earn it yourself. Richard buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with pathetic, racking sobs. Georgiana, seeing her brother fold, turned entirely feral. You weak, pathetic fool, she spat at Richard, kicking him in the side. You wanted the money just as much as I did. You poured the drops yourself on Sunday when I was in the village. Do not pretend you are innocent. Enough! Lord Pendleton roared, slamming his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block. The sharp crack silenced the siblings instantly. I have heard quite enough to determine the truth of this matter, the High Magistrate declared, standing up. His shadow loomed over the courtroom. Duke Richard Sterling, your petition for guardianship is denied permanently. Furthermore, by the power vested in me by the Crown, I am issuing immediate warrants for the arrest of Lady Georgiana and Duke Richard Sterling on the charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and the attempted murder of a peer of the realm. Georgiana screamed a raw, guttural sound of pure defeat. Two King's Guards moved forward, immediately grabbing her by the arms of her plum silk gown and dragging her away from the benches. She thrashed wildly, her heavy jaw locked in a snarl, screaming curses at Eleanor, at Richard, at the magistrate, until the heavy doors closed behind her, cutting off her voice. Richard did not fight. When the guards pulled him to his feet, he remained limp, his watery blue eyes fixed on Eleanor, begging for a mercy he had never shown her. Eleanor, he whispered as they snapped the iron cuffs around his wrists. What will happen to me? You will be forgotten, Richard, Eleanor said simply. Her face was a mask of beautiful, untouchable ice. That is the heaviest sentence of all. As the guards led him away, the courtroom descended into a stunned, ringing silence. The threat was gone. The monsters who had haunted her halls and poisoned her tea had been dragged into the light and burned to ash. Mr. Arras stepped forward, handing a final document to Lord Pendleton. It was the decree severing Richard's legal ties to the Sterling estate, entirely returning absolute control to Eleanor. The magistrate signed it without hesitation and handed it down to her. The court extends its deepest apologies for what you have endured. Your Grace, Lord Pendleton said, bowing his head slightly. You are a woman of extraordinary resilience. Thank you, Your Honor, Eleanor replied. She took the document, folded it neatly, and placed it inside her coat. She turned around. The gallery of aristocrats parted like the Red Sea. No one dared to speak. No one dared to meet her eye. They looked at her not with pity, but with a profound, terrifying respect. The woman they had whispered about, the frail Duchess who was losing her mind, had just orchestrated the utter destruction of her enemies with the precision of a master tactician. Eleanor Sterling walked down the center aisle of the Court of Chancery. The sharp click-clack of her riding boots echoed one last time against the stone walls. When she reached the massive double doors, she did not look back at the room, nor at the memory of the husband who had tried to break her. She stepped out into the brilliant, blinding sunlight of the London morning, taking a deep breath of clean, unpoisoned air. 3 years later, the Sterling Manor had been transformed. Eleanor had stripped the heavy velvet curtains from the dining room, allowing the sunlight to pour over the mahogany floors. The dark, oppressive artwork of Richard's ancestors had been sold at auction, replaced by bright landscapes and open windows. She had reclaimed her ancestral home, purging every ghost, every shadow, and every memory of the weak man who had once occupied it. Richard had been sentenced to 20 years in a remote, brutal prison in the north. Word had reached London that his health, fragile without the comforts of wealth, was failing rapidly. Georgiana had received a life sentence locked away in a penitentiary for violent women, her arrogance finally broken by the stone walls and iron bars of a cell she could not bribe her way out of. Eleanor never married again. She had no need for a husband to validate her existence or manage her wealth. She became a formidable presence in London society and a quiet, anonymous benefactor to women seeking legal refuge from abusive marriages. She funded solicitors, provided safe houses, and ensured that no woman under her protection would ever be forced to sign away her sanity in the dark. On a quiet Sunday morning, Eleanor sat by the large open window of her bedchamber sipping a cup of pure, fragrant jasmine tea. The air was crisp and clean. Resting on her mahogany writing desk, encased in a small, elegant glass dome, was a silver tea strainer. It was perfectly polished, gleaming in the morning light. She kept it not as a morbid souvenir, but as a permanent, silent reminder. Pain could break a woman, or it could forge her into something untouchable. Eleanor took another sip of her tea, looking out over the vast green expanse of her estate. She smiled a genuine, warm expression that finally reached her eyes. The poison was gone, the legacy was hers, and the room that had once mocked her was finally permanently silent.